Greetings. Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the history of Catholicism in the United States, moving into the decade of the 1880s. Divisions within the American Catholic hierarchy manifested in multiple arenas of conflict during the decade of the 1880s, beginning notably with a question, like what is the proper attitude of the church toward labor unions? The pattern which we will see is that the Americanists among the hierarchy, and that today more or less that would equate with liberals today, were sympathetic to the unions, perceiving them as legitimate alliances among workers to resist industrial exploitation. While ultramontanes, that corresponds to the conservatives today. Ultramontane means beyond the mountains, so beyond the Alpine mountains, meaning we look beyond, to the Pope. Forgot that ultramontanes would be the conservatives, were opposed to labor unions, seeing them as fronts for communist infiltration. Parallel ambivalence toward labor unions existed in the larger society. The right of laborers to organize into unions was not guaranteed in law until the National Labor Relations Act, better known as the Wagner Act, of 1935. Now, the Constitution does provide the right of assembly, the right of free association, and the right to petition for redress of grievances. But unions, labor unions, were seen by some as enemy organizations, like representatives of foreign powers, of communist infiltration in the country. The issue could not be ignored by the Catholic hierarchy, as the first national labor union in the United States was organized by Catholics and remained a majority Catholic, called the Knights of Labor. Now, I have to make some distinctions here. It was not the first union. It was the first national labor union, and that also had open membership. So previously organized labor unions were local and more analogous to the medieval craft guilds. So it would be, like carpenters coming together, or railway workers coming together, or garment workers coming together. Whereas the Knights of Labor was open to all laborers, and it was national. The Knights of Labor was founded in 1869 in Philadelphia, initially to protest employer mistreatment of employees. It was a secret society initially to protect its members from further reprisals. Officially called itself the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor, taking as its motto, "An injury to one is a concern to all." A garment worker named Uriah Stevens, along with several of his colleagues, banded together an open membership to anyone except physicians, lawyers, bankers, professional gamblers, stockbrokers, and liquor dealers. So, it was really for workers. So it was open, but it was for those who made their living working with their hands, so to speak, as opposed to the professional classes. In the 1870s, the Knights of Labor spread their organization by recruiting Pennsylvania coal miners. In 1879, the Knights had 10,000 members. By 1886, the decade now under our consideration, it had expanded to 730,000 members in multiple states. As the pioneering attempt at a national organization for workers without legal protection. The founding Knights of Labor practiced open membership recruiting, including recruiting women, blacks, immigrants of all ethnicities, as well as unskilled and semi-skilled workers. Their program set the agenda for subsequent labor activism. At a general meeting of its members in Reading, Pennsylvania in 1878, the organization set as its goals, first, an 8-hour workday protected by law. Second, prohibition of child labor, which they defined as under the age of 14. Third, equal opportunities and wages for women laborers. And finally, an end to the use of convict labor, prison labor, as they saw that as unfair competition, which it was, because it was essentially slave labor. The group became involved in numerous strikes in the late 1870s into the mid-1880s. Strikes, as the laws were written at the time, strikes were either illegal completely or at least not protected in law. Some states just had not written legislation pertinent to it. But each state was different. When some of these strikes became violent, membership of the Knights divided between moderates and radicals. Moderates wished to discard the strike as a tool, believing that it discredited them by validating the widespread assumption that unions were just a front for a communist. While instead the moderates wanted to continue pursuing their open membership policy and in place of strikes, lobbying for the creation of labor bureaus, government labor bureaus that would oversee public arbitration in disputes between workers and owners. While radicals among the Knights saw that as naive. They believed that only violence and fear would move the wealthy, move the owners, the owners of the industry, to grant any concessions. And the radicals wished to purge the membership of the Knights of moderates, whom in their eyes they saw as sabotaging the mission. In September of 1879, the moderates had sufficient numbers to elect Terence Powderly as Grand Master Workman. That was essentially the president, the executive officer of the Knights. This guy was Catholic, Terence Vincent Powderly, born in Carbondale, Pennsylvania, on the 22nd of January, 1849, the 11th of 12 children born to Irish Catholic immigrants. He was named for his father, Terence. His mother's name was Madge Walsh. Parents came to the United States in 1827. As a child, Terence contracted measles as well as scarlet fever, which left him deaf in one ear, and left him with a lifelong diminished constitution. He had afflicted with low energy. Nevertheless, he had to work, because it's just okay. So I have low energy, but so that means life is going to suck a little more than it would have otherwise. So at the age of 13, which was typical for the time, he began work for the railroad as a switchman with the Delaware and Hudson Railway. Through diligence and reliability, he compensated for his physical limitations, rising to become a car examiner, a repairer, and eventually a brakeman. From August 1st, 1866, Powderly was accepted as apprentice machinist to a guy named James Dixon. Dixon was a British immigrant engineer who changed history. He's considered the father of railways, although there's several that depended on which. Anyway, so the reason being that James and his son Robert established the Robert Stephenson and Company, Incorporated, which in 1825 launched the Locomotion Number 1, the first steam locomotive to carry passengers on a public rail line, the Stockton and Darlington Railway. In 1830, George also built the first public intercity railway line in the world to use locomotives, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. So James Dixon had apprenticed with those guys, then came to the United States, and then Terence Powderly apprenticed with James Dixon. On November 21st, 1871, now completed with his apprenticeship, Powderly joined the Subordinate Union Number 2 of Pennsylvania, part of the Machinists and Blacksmiths Union. And a year later, he was elected as its secretary, and then next term he was elected president of that union. But you see, it's a constricted, like it's just for the machinists and blacksmiths. It's not open yet. So, as I said, unions did exist, but the Knights of Labor was something new in the sense of being open to all types of laborers and being intentionally seeking to be national. On September 19th, 1872, Powderly married a lady named Hannah Deaver. Powderly, 1 year later, was fired from his job because he was president of that union, of the Machinists and Blacksmiths Union. Lacking independent resources, Powderly traveled as far as Canada, earning whatever he could as a day laborer. He returned to northeastern Pennsylvania in 1874, settling in Scranton and joining Pennsylvania Union Number 6. In the 1840s, Scranton only existed because in the 1840s, two brothers, Selden and George Scranton, who had worked at the Oxford Furnace in New Jersey, struck out on their own, and they founded what became the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company, later developing into the Lackawanna Steel Company. The Erie Railroad's construction in New York State had been delayed by its having to acquire iron rails imported from England. So Selden and George perceived an opportunity in this, that they could provide this quicker if they did it on site, or at least, on our side of the ocean instead of, waiting for it to be transported from England. So they fill that need. And the Scranton's firm the brothers made their first fortune producing T-rails for the Erie Railroad. 1851, the brothers, Scranton, built the Lackawanna and Western Railroad, the L&W, northward, with recent Irish Catholic immigrants supplying most of the labor. They linked it to the Erie Railroad. They came together in Great Bend, Pennsylvania. Thus, they could transport manufactured rails from the Lackawanna Valley all the way to New York in the Midwest by going all the way through rails without having, to unload or, and do that. Because every time unloading, that means somebody's got to touch all that. And that takes time and that takes money. So they made a second fortune doing this. They also invested in coal mining operations in the city to fuel their steel operations, but they mined more than they needed for their own company, so they sold the surplus, making a third fortune. In 1856, they expanded the railroad eastward as the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, the DL&W, in order to tap into New York City's metropolitan market. That railroad, with its hub in Scranton, named for them, was Scranton's largest employer for almost 100 years. In 1856, the borough of Scranton was officially incorporated as a city of 35,000 and named for the two brothers as the benefactors that made the existence of the city possible because of all their business. The Panic of 1873 was the first global economic depression brought about by industrial capitalism. It began a regular pattern of boom and bust cycles that distinguish our current economic system and which continue to this day. Unlike earlier mercantile economic systems, which were dependent on local markets and periodic shortages of labor or materials, and that's what caused problems. By way of contrast, that industrial capitalism was dependent on access to venture capital, as we'd say today, liquid capital, and the productivity of capital investments in stocks, bonds, and large-scale mechanization. So in the capitalist system, as distinct from the mercantile system, money, liquid money, movable money available for investment, not labor or goods, was the critical factor in economic growth. Now, that does not mean labor and material goods were irrelevant. It just meant that in the hierarchy of the process, that as the steps, of a process, of an economic process, the liquid capital came first, because without that there were no labor or goods, and they couldn't be transported. All right. In a capitalist system, money supply, liquid money, money available for investment, is like oxygen for the fire. Too little and the flame dwindles, and the economic processes slow down. So that's a deflationary environment. Too much liquid capital available is too much oxygen for the fire, then it rages uncontrolled. Then you have inflation. The Panic of 1873 led to the longest recorded economic downturn in modern history, spanning from October of 1873 to March of 1879, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. And that's, the 1929 depression is going to change things because the stock market was in. Well, anyway, so how did this happen? By 1873, most developed nations in Europe and North America had experienced the transition to industrial capitalism. Capitalists could invest their money in international currencies, ownership of individual firms through stock purchases, or as lenders, issuing bonds or making loans. Nations backed their currencies using precious metals. At the time, prior to 1873, both gold and silver, which was called specie from the Latin, just means in kind, meaning in coin. This made it possible for investors to compare the success of their investment choices in objective terms. As the German, the German mark and the French franc, English pound, the American dollar. Even if at times they issued paper money, they were all, claimed that paper money was secure because it was based on the amount of gold and silver that those countries had in their vaults, in their treasuries. So that meant that even if using paper money, if it was all backed by gold and silver has objective value because it doesn't rust, then it was possible to have international pricing, at least among industrial nations, that was comparable and able to be calculated. In times of national emergency, however, governments went off the precious metal standard. They supplied paper money, backed truly, in reality, backed by nothing but the population's willingness to accept it. And that was the case of the United States during the Civil War. The greenbacks. During the Civil War, the federal government printed over $356 million in paper money, greenbacks. The greenback paper money is essentially a promissory note, an IOU. But the North used it to pay for military procurements, soldier salaries, building a transcontinental railroad, developing interior land for commerce, higher education, through terraforming, roads, bridges, canals. Mass manufacturers, financial institutions, were also integrated into this use of paper money, because that's who the government, was private firms who were making the cannons and the muskets and the gunpowder and all that, that they needed. And the railroads, building the railroads. So that they all soaked up this paper money during the war, producing more goods and employing more people over a broader geographic market than would have been possible if everything had to be paid for at the moment of exchange with coined money, with actual gold or silver coins. Okay. Northern investment bankers, and the one who's salient for this story is J. Cook and Company, who managed, Northern investment bankers in general, managed transfer of these funds and made multiple fortunes, the continuance of which was predicated on consumers. And during the Civil War, this included the U.S. government, was the largest consumer, continued access to paper money to purchase modern goods and services produced by the industrial economy. So they made money off of the war, a lot of money off of the war. And when the war ended, the fear, there were multiple fears, is are they going to have enough consumers to buy stuff? They have all these industries tooled up, but with the war over, they don't need to produce as many weapons, but they can produce other stuff, that people might want to buy. But those people have to have money to buy it. Beginning in the early 1870s, several leading industrial nations made significant changes to their national currency, which unknowingly and not intended, this is an unforeseen, the law of unintended consequences, those changes triggered the Panic of 1873. In the following, this is the sequence. In 1871, Germany ended the use of silver as a monetary metal, while placing the Deutschmark on the gold standard, simply the gold standard. That instantly increased the value of Germany's money relative to other currencies. But correlatively, naturally, it meant an instant loss of value, for the world silver supply all of a sudden became less valuable. And correlatively, further, mining interest in silver and all the ancillary businesses that were employed, supplied, transported, converted, invested silver and silver products all instantly lost value. That didn't become worthless because at this point Germany was the only one that did it, so other countries were still using silver in currency. But without action, this could also threaten the value of gold, either making gold so valuable that it was not usable for ordinary transactions, and then as a second order effect, meaning that de facto consumers would have to default to barter and just not use gold. As if gold became too valuable, you couldn't just take a gold coin to buy groceries, because it costs too much. And then the grocers would not have enough gold coins on hand, smaller gold coins, to make change for you. But you still had to buy groceries. So that would force people to go to some kind of barter economy. And that would deprive the national economies on the macro level of the advantage of having the uniform international standard, metal standards, to calculate pricing. For example, a person holding bulk silver in Germany after this decision, angry at the sudden loss of value of his investment, could take his silver to a country like the United States that was still using silver as legal tender, trade his silver, his more valuable silver, in for gold, for U.S. gold, then bring that gold back to Germany, giving him substantially increased purchasing power. So whereas he initially got silver that had some value, not as much as gold, but did have some value, then when they took silver off of the monetary standard, they immediately lost value. So now just by doing this, he comes back and has gold value, a gold value investment, whereas originally he only had silver. So that gives him substantially increased purchasing power. This prompted other industrial nations to adopt the gold-only standard, as they recognized this is what some German investors were doing, taking the German silver to their country, trading it in for gold, bringing that back to Germany, therefore draining those other countries like the United States of their gold. So the United States did this with the Coinage Act of 1873, announcing to the public that silver as a currency was going to gradually be retired from circulation to gradually bolster the relative value of the U.S. gold dollar. So this was an attempt to ease the transition. The U.S. Treasury made another initiative to ease the transition by printing an additional $26 million worth of greenbacks and stipulating that silver would still be recognized as legal tender for international transactions with countries that still used silver. But silver would no longer be used for domestic circulation, meaning silver would no longer be coined for domestic circulation. So these well-intentioned moves inadvertently complicated the situation with even more confusion. In 1873, then, the United States, after the Coinage Act, had three currencies: gold coins, paper money, allegedly backed by gold coins, and silver coins, which were being phased out of daily use, but which could remain in use for foreign commerce. Since most Americans did not engage in foreign trade, they didn't know what to do. Should I trade in my silver right now for paper money? Should I trade in the silver for gold coins, knowing that the gold coins are now too valuable for daily use, such as buying groceries? Or should I hold on to my silver in case this policy changes? And if the policy did change and the national currency went back to the bimetal standard, well, then my silver gets valuable again. And on the subject of groceries and other small businesses, which needed access to regular credit to acquire inventory to put up for sale, access to credit abruptly closed as lenders faced the similar uncertainty. Which kind of currency do I loan, and for how long? And how can I set interest payments? And what can the interest be repaid in? The next level of malfunction was with bond and stockholders. Consider, if they purchased their bond or stock with silver or with paper money, then they rushed to redeem that in gold to get it back, to cash it in and get their gold back. Now, of course, it didn't exist. I mean, gold existed, but the amount of gold did not exist in sufficient quantities to meet the obligation calculated by the total amount of paper money, bonds, and stocks issued. Within that malfunction, we find the source of the combustion for the entire panic of 1873. Because all the industrial nations were building vast railroad networks at the same time. And all such endeavors were partly financed with both stock and bond issues. Because nobody had enough gold coins to pay up front for all of this. The banking houses of those same countries used those stock and bond issues as instruments to invest their depositors' funds to make a profit for themselves while holding the money. So, say Joe Grocer deposits $20,000 with his bank. The bank, rather than just putting that in a vault, wants to make money off of it. So the bankers would invest, they would purchase stocks and bonds, and railroad was the thing. So they would take the Grocer Joe's $20,000, buy that amount of stocks and bonds, but the dividends would go to the bank, not to Joe the grocer. Now, if they, as part of the deposit, they might pay some interest to Joe the grocer, but it's going to be less than the amount of dividends that they make from investing Joe the grocer's money. Well, in the United States alone, 33,000 miles of new railroad track were laid across the country in 5 years, facilitated by the land grants given to railroad companies, and then the railroad companies in turn acquired public money from private investors by issuing stocks and bonds. That allowed them to raise capital and establish to build more stations, and therefore build more railway cars, transport more freight, transport more passengers, all of which they charged for, so they make money, and that allows them to pay the dividends on the stocks. So that's the whole the material continuum. However, with the German move to the gold-only monetary standard, and with all the problems that caused in other countries, as we covered, people started going to their local banks to withdraw the gold value of their deposits. Or, when holders of railroad stocks and bonds went to their banks or went to the railroad, depending on how they acquired the stocks and bonds, and wanted to cash in their bond for gold value, for its gold value, all at once, those local banks then needed the money to repay these people. But the banks had been making money by investing in larger railroad bonds. But now the value of those railroad bonds was going down because there was a run, because everyone wanted to cash in those bonds at the same time. Hence, too many people were demanding too much gold at the same time in quantities that never existed. Chronologically, the first financial institution to collapse under the pressure of this rush was the stock exchange in Vienna, Austria, on the 9th of May, 1873. It closed. I say crashed, I mean it announced it was insolvent and crashed. It could no longer meet its obligations. From there, the cascade accelerated. Smaller banks and businesses that had invested in the Vienna Stock Exchange collapsed, and then other banks, foreign banks, and other businesses that had invested in those businesses that had invested in the Vienna stock, so those also collapsed. So they're spiraling into oblivion. The first financial institution in the United States, as the ripple effect went, and the tsunami, spread from that epicenter of Vienna out and drowned thousands of institutions. The first one in the United States to fall was the Bank of J. Cook and Company on September 13th, 1873. It had opened in Philadelphia in 1861. J. Cook made his first fortune brokering victory bonds to finance the Union war effort. It did so well that he opened 2 other branches. In addition to Philadelphia, he opened a branch in New York City and another in Washington, D.C. J. Cook and Company was the first wire service investment bank, pioneering the use of telegraph messages to confirm securities transactions with clients. J. Cook himself was born in Ohio in 1821 and died in Pennsylvania in 1905. In terms of the Panic of 1873, J. Cook personally, along with the bank, J. Cook and Company, was deeply invested in railroad construction, including the Northern Pacific Railroad. Like the more famous Union Pacific Line, which we covered in the in the 1860s, the Northern Pacific was fueled by vast land grants, over 60 million acres, signed over to Cook's firm. And then those land grants, they could do different things with them. They could sell the land, they could lease the land, they could rent the land, and wherever railroad stations were, then towns would accrete around that, and those would be located, near water sources. Both obviously for drinking for the people who live there and need water, but also transportation. And he could use those land grants, as well as the profit potential of the railroad as collateral to sell more stock and bonds and to secure further loans. So this is selling stocks and bonds not only in the railroad company, but also in his own bank. The contraction of currency that we just described dried up investor interest in these speculative lands. They all panicked and reacted, and that's why it's called the Panic of 1873. They all wanted to cash in their stocks, bonds, and investments for gold. They planned to just put their gold in their basement and wait for better times, see what was going to happen. This meant that Cook personally, as well as his bank, was unable to service their debts. And when they issued stocks and bonds, those were a debt for them. They owed interest to their investors on their dividends to their investors. So because of this pressure, Cook's firm folded. His bank failed. On September 13th, 1873, closed its doors, announced that it was insolvent, could not meet its obligations. That bankruptcy rippled through the American markets, first into private investment banks and houses that had invested in his bank, because his bank was the big thing. Then those banks that had invested, followed his example, even if they didn't directly invest with him, followed his example by investing their funds in railroad stocks and bonds. And so this rippled through, and all those companies that were on the New York Stock Exchange, all had the same problem. So the New York Stock Exchange had the same problem as the Vienna Stock Exchange. Now they tried to get ahead of it because they knew what happened in Vienna, so they understood what was happening eventually. So the board of the New York Stock Exchange closed it. They closed the New York Stock Exchange for 10 days, starting on September 20th, 1873. Nevertheless, the panic continued. By November of 1873, 55 of the nation's railroads failed, and another 60 had gone bankrupt by the first anniversary, within a year. Another 115. In 1 year, 115 railroads went bankrupt. Construction of new railway lines, which had been the backbone of the economy since the 1830s, plummeted, causing widespread unemployment. An ironic product of most depressions, economic depressions, is that those who had access to sound capital investments found that their money was now more valuable. They could and did used this advantage to acquire controlling interest over these banks to buy, because the railroad still had value, objective value, because the tracks were there, the locomotives were there, the towns were there that along the line. It's just because of this capital, this investment problem, that they were not liquid, so they could no longer pay their employees. They could no longer buy coal to transport things, but the material was still there. Now, with the company bankrupt, if someone else whose money was in something else that had not invested in these stocks and still had money, then he has an opportunity. With 115 railroads now bankrupt, he can swoop in and buy those railroads very cheaply. And he has money that they can start working again. So he can make money off that railroad while the competitor railroads are bankrupt. Now, they'll eventually be bought out by other people too. But it's the irony of these economic depressions. Some people lose everything, but others can capitalize on that and make even more money. Large, wealthy manufacturers, names that are familiar in American history: Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, Cyrus McCormick, all solidified their holdings and expanded their fortunes because of the Panic of 1873. By 1890, 71% of the nation's wealth belonged to 9% of the public. The Panic of 1873 also had political implications. It shattered the balance of power between the existing two-party system, such that from 1873 to 1896, the country witnessed a series of insurgent third parties, driven by a desire to address monetary policy in America. The argument being gold standard, bimetallism, meaning gold and silver, or paper money, or some combination thereof. This provides a fuller context for the life of Terence Powderly and the Catholic Knights of Labor, the majority Catholic National Labor Union. In Scranton, mine workers and railroad men walked off the job, protesting layoffs and wage cuts. A protest of 5,000 workers in such a strike ended in violence, with 4 men killed and 50 injured, including the mayor of Scranton. The mayor, who was injured, he called for help from the governor and the state militia, but eventually the governor of Pennsylvania requested federal troops to put down the strike. Even though that violates Posse Comitatus, nevertheless, laws only apply to us; they don't apply to the government. That's and the workers. I mean, they didn't understand all the dynamics of all these stock investments and why that failed and not. But they knew, they already had before the Panic low pay, long hours, unsafe working conditions. Children as young as 8 or 9 worked 14 hours a day, separating slate from coal. Often workers were forced to use company-provided housing and groceries for which they had to pay, and if they couldn't afford to pay it, then that became a debt that they owed to the company. The company would garnish their already low wages to pay for that. And with the hundreds of thousands of immigrants arriving in the industrial cities, mine owners did not have to search for labor or workers. So if workers, when they protest, okay, fine, you're fired. I'm gonna go hire these guys, who are coming from another country, and they're grateful for the low pay because they had nothing where they came from. In August of that year, 1874, Powderly was elected by number 6 as a delegate to a district meeting of their union. This is the machinist and blacksmiths union, representing other posts in Pittsburgh, Meadsville, and Franklin, all in Pennsylvania. Powderly at this meeting was in turn elected to represent that district at a general convention, multi-state convention, held in Louisville, Kentucky in September. This brought him the same sort of attention that led to him being fired earlier in his life, and of course it happened again. He was fired again. This pattern repeated in his life until 1878, when he was elected to the first of what turned out to be 3 terms as mayor of Scranton, representing the Greenback Party, a third party, which favored departure from gold, from the gold and silver, either gold or gold and silver, as the sole legal tender, favoring instead the exclusive use of paper money. During the election, he proposed financing public works projects for the unemployed through low-interest government loans as a means of providing work. But Scranton did not have the gold to pay for that, so of course it could only be funded with paper money. The following year, September of 1879, while serving as mayor of Scranton, Powderly was elected as Grand Master Workman, or as president of the Knights of Labor, so that catches us up to where we started. So I gave all this background because the Knights of Labor later in the decade are going to become an issue, a big issue. And labor in general is going to be a big issue for which the church has to deal with, because in this period, so many of the immigrants were Catholic. The Irish, the Italians, and they were looking for these kind of jobs. They needed those kind of jobs, and they would take them because they would do anything, digging canals, making railroads, doing whatever, because they had to eat. All right. 1880 was a census year. Census was taken, indicating that the national population, for the first time, exceeded 50 million people. Specifically, 50,189,209. That was an increase of 30% over the previous census, which was 10 years earlier. So 30% increase in the population in 10 years. The geographic center of the U.S. population by 1880 was in the Ohio and Kentucky, Ohio, Missouri, Kentucky, that area. 1880 is also an election year, federal election year. November 2nd, 1880, James Garfield was a Republican, was elected president after defeating Winfield Hancock, the Democratic candidate. Garfield received 214 electoral votes, Hancock 155. But Garfield barely won the popular vote. He won the popular vote by 7,023. Okay, 1880 was the 24th quadrennial presidential election. Voter turnout rate was one of the highest in the nation's history up to that point. And even afterwards, as far as a percentage of the population, it remains one of the highest. The incumbent president, Rutherford B. Hayes, did not seek re-election, as we covered that earlier. He had kept that. He promised that during the 1876 campaign, so it was open. After the longest convention in the party's history, the Republicans chose another guy from Ohio, as Hayes had been, James Garfield. He was a representative from Ohio as their standard bearer. The Democrats chose a military guy, Winfield Scott Hancock of Pennsylvania. The dominance of the two-party system frayed because of the panic of 1873, and the economic damage was still going on. So both parties had to deal with a rising challenge from the Greenback Party, which is what Powderly was, favoring, going off of any metal standard and just using paper money. Okay. Let's skip all that. All right, yeah. So anyway, that's what happened. Garfield won. Back to the church. The national humiliation, part of the panic of 1873 led to something we covered in the previous decade in Cincinnati. The Archdiocese of Cincinnati had created a bank, a diocesan bank, but that bank did what all the other banks were doing and was making money by investing their depositors' money in railroad stocks and bonds. So they could still pay their depositors an amount of interest, but also make a profit because the dividends they received were higher than the amount of interest they were paying to their depositors. Well, with the crash, the same thing happened to the Diocesan Bank as happened to all those other banks. That bank crashed, leading to the national humiliation of Archbishop Purcell, because it was not just a bank run by Catholics in the Diocese of Cincinnati. The bank was run by the Archdiocese, so the Archdiocese was on the hook for this. And he never recovered. I mean, he didn't understand economics. He understood that, people had trusted that, so it caused him to retire, request a replacement. Archbishop Henney in Milwaukee, we also met previously, who was he lobbied for a German speaker to replace Purcell, who was Irish, as Archbishop of Cincinnati because of the large-scale German immigration to Ohio. While Archbishop Fian, Patrick Fian of Chicago, along with James Gibbons of Baltimore, lobbied for an English speaker, an English speaker, preferably Irish from their perspective, because the Irish clergy at the time were those who were facilitating Americanization and assimilation of immigrants, for them to rapidly learn English and leave behind, like for the Germans to leave behind their language and their culture and just become American. In the end, Rome chose the Bishop of Natchez, Mississippi, and transferred him to become Archbishop of Cincinnati. His name was William Henry Elder, E-L-D-E-R. He was born in Baltimore, 1819, descended from Anglo-Catholic immigrants when Maryland was still a proprietary colony of the Calvert family. Elder's first cousin was Catherine Spalding, who was one of the co-foundresses of the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, Kentucky. In 1831, Elder entered Mount St. Mary's College in Emmitsburg, Maryland, which was then presided over by none other than, it was then Father John Purcell, the guy who ended up in Cincinnati that Elder ended up replacing. Elder graduated 1837 from that college, then entered the seminary in the same, also Mount St. Mary's Seminary. 1842, he was sent for major seminary to the Urban College in Rome, where he received a doctorate of divinity. Elder was ordained a priest in Rome on March 29th, 1846. He became professor. When he came back, he was appointed professor at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, a position he held until he was appointed Bishop of Natchez. He was consecrated in the cathedral in Baltimore by Archbishop Francis Kenrick, whom we've met many times, on May 3rd, 1857. The Diocese of Natchez, at the time, comprised the entire state of Mississippi. And I'll just summarize its history. It was a missionary territory first. It was a apostolic vicariate of Mississippi created on July 18th, 1826. It then became an ordinary Diocese of Natchez, July 28th, 1837, 11 years later. The name was changed to the Diocese of Natchez-Jackson, December 18th, 1956, then changed again to simply the Diocese of Jackson on March 1st, 1977. During the Civil War, Bishop Elder, still in Natchez, sent priests to serve as chaplains to the Confederate Army and Sisters of Mercy to nurse the sick and wounded. During the Union occupation of Natchez, which the North called Reconstruction, Elder caused some controversy by refusing to obey an order to have prayers for the President of the United States recited publicly in the churches of the diocese. On June 18, 1864, the Union commander of the garrison occupying Natchez was a Colonel B.G. Farrar. He was a former schoolmate of he was Catholic, former schoolmate of elders at Mount St. Mary's. He issued an order requiring the clergy to do these prayers for the president and Mass, quote, as a public recognition of allegiance under which they live and to which they are indebted to protection. For protection. Bishop Elder responded with a letter of protest in which he explained he was declining this. He was not going to order his priest to do this. And explaining that he was doing this not for political reasons, but because, quote, the liberty of the church to discharge her divine functions without interference from other persons. The next level up, the Brigadier General James Tuttle issued another order for enforcement, which Elder requested. He said, "Oh, okay, now so I'm not refusing, but I'm just asking that you pause, you stay enforcement, because I'm going to write to the president that you're asking me to pray for and explain the situation." So Elder wrote to Lincoln, explaining that his refusal was not a political statement, but was based on the authority of the church to regulate church services. So, if a civil authority was commanding that we add a prayer to the Mass, that violated the separation of church and state. Lincoln personally didn't respond, but he gave it to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And Stanton replied that he would communicate to the General Tuttle that there would be no further interference. Elder subsequently wrote thanks for the protections of religious freedom. Later, Colonel Farrar, Elder's old classmate, was placed in command of Natchez. He noted that Tuttle's order had neither been rescinded nor was being obeyed. And here we have there's some kind of, the left hand doesn't know the right. So Elder had a letter from Secretary Stanton indicating that it was not going to be enforced. But the general who made the order did not rescind it. So either he didn't get the letter or he was ignoring the letter or whatever. Then Tuttle was transferred. He was replaced by another general, General Mason Brayman. He took a harder stance, saying military orders are to be followed. They're not to be discussed. So he issued yet another order for Elder to do this. Elder refused. So he had Bishop Elder arrested and incarcerated in Vidalia, taking him to another state, taking him out of his state of Mississippi and incarcerating him at a POW camp in Vidalia, Louisiana. But Elder he didn't have it on him, but he had the proof from the Secretary of War, Stanton. So once he just disappeared, like he was just arrested, and his priest didn't know where he was. So it took a while for them to find out. Then the letter was from the Secretary of War, was recovered, and eventually they obtained Elder's release on August 12th, 1864. But the whole thing was an ugly, episode. Also during his time in Natchez, a yellow fever epidemic broke out in 1878. Ministering to the sick, Elder caught the disease, but he survived. 6 other of his priests did not. They were also ministering to the sick, caught the disease, and they did not survive. When he arrived, first in Natchez, it had 11 missions, 11 churches, served by 9 priests, and the missions served about 10,000 Catholics. By the time he left, when he got transferred to Cincinnati, the diocese had 41 churches, 25 priests, 6 religious houses for men, 5 convents for women, and 13 Catholic schools. On January 30th, 1880, he was transferred to Cincinnati, becoming coadjutor bishop to Archbishop Purcell, whom he succeeded as on July 4th, 1883. Archbishop Elder was the third bishop and the second archbishop of Cincinnati. He methodically set about the reorganization of the administration of the diocese, recovering from the scandal and the collapse of the Purcell Bank. He instituted the office of Chancellor of the Diocese, instituted annual reports from the clergy and parishes, and frankly taxed, they called it the Cathedraticum, but taxed the parishes in a way that many of the priests regarded as gouging in order to pay off the debt. So the diocesan bank, even though it failed like so many other banks, but eventually the holders did get their money back. Eventually those debts were made good, which could not be said for other banks. Elder served in Cincinnati until his death in 1904. He died during one of the influenza outbreaks. So he was giving last rites to the sick. He contracted it, and this time he did not survive. In New York, Cardinal Mccluskey, and we met previously, received permission from Pope Pius IX to nominate a coadjutor bishop, meaning automatic successor. He received this permission in 1876, and he kept the permission just, for when he needed it. He availed himself of this permission on April 7th, 1880, by sending a terna, meaning a list of 3 names, with the following order of preference to be his coadjutor and successor. First, Patrick Lynch, Bishop of Charleston, whom we met during the Civil War. John Laughlin, Bishop of Brooklyn. And Michael Corrigan, Bishop of Newark, New Jersey. Archbishop James Gibbons of Baltimore, speaking as an Americanist, a liberal in their terms, sabotaged the first by pointing out to Rome that Lynch had been pro-Confederate to the extent that he actually served as an envoy for the Confederate States. And attempted to get Vatican rec. He reminded the Vatican, this is the guy, who went to Rome during the Civil War to try to get you to recognize the Confederacy as a nation. Appointing a person with such a history to the largest city in the North, Gibbons concluded, would be antagonistic and would raise the ire of an already suspicious majority Protestant population. The second, Bishop Laughlin's candidacy, was dismissed on the grounds of age. Because Rome, nobody had a problem with him, but Mccluskey was asking for a coadjutor because he felt that he was too old. So why appoint someone who was also elderly? So as it turned out, the third was exactly what propaganda was looking for: Michael Augustine Corrigan. His parents were born in Ireland, but he was born in the United States. Corrigan had come under the influence, I should give you his dates. Corrigan was born in 1839, and he died in 1902. Corrigan had, earlier in life, had come under the influence of Father Bernard Mcquade, who later became the first bishop of Rochester. Well, in order, he became the first president of Seton Hall University and then later became the first bishop of Rochester, New York. Both of them, Corrigan and Mcquade, served under a famous archbishop who was a convert, a famous American convert of the 19th century, Bishop and later Archbishop James Roosevelt Bailey, Bayley. Bailey, as we'll see, he became Bishop of Newark and then Archbishop of Baltimore. James Roosevelt Bailey was born in New York City on August 23rd, 1814, born during the War of 1812, and while St. Elizabeth Ann Seton was still alive. St. Elizabeth was his aunt. The shared ancestor was Dr. Richard Bailey, professor of Columbia College, New York, and the first medical officer, public medical officer of New York after independence. So essentially the coroner, medical examiner. They're called different things today. Dr. Richard Bailey was St. Elizabeth Ann Seton's father and Archbishop Bailey's paternal grandfather. In 1766, Richard apprenticed to New York physician John Charlton. Bailey married John Charlton's sister, Catherine Charlton. They were Episcopal at the time, so they married at St. John's Episcopal Church in 1767. Her father was an Episcopal clergyman. He was rector of St. Andrew's Church, Staten Island, New York. The couple had 3 children, Magdalene, Elizabeth, and Catherine. Elizabeth, the middle one, is the one who we know as Mother Seton or St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. During the American Revolution, Richard was a royalist. He enlisted in the British Army as a surgeon, was stationed in Newport, Rhode Island. In 1777, his wife became very ill, so he returned to New York. He left the Army and returned to New York to care for her, but she died in May. He took no further part in the American Revolution. 13 months after his first wife's death, Dr. Richard married Charlotte Amelia Barclay, Barclay. 3 daughters and 4 sons were born to this marriage. One of the sons was named Guy, Guy. He was the father of the guy who became Archbishop James Roosevelt Bailey, whom we're now covering. In other historic connections, Richard's second wife, Bishop Bailey's mother, was a member of the Roosevelt family. Descendants of a mid-17th century Dutch immigrant to New York when it was still the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. 2 related branches of the Roosevelt family, the Oyster Bay branch and the Hyde Park branch, both in New York, rose to national prominence with the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and his 5th cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt's wife, the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, was Theodore Roosevelt's niece. Archbishop James Roosevelt Bailey, whom we're covering, was a first cousin to Franklin Roosevelt's father and a 4th cousin to Theodore Roosevelt. So the common ancestor of all these people was Klaus Martensen van Rosenvelt. Lived from 1626 to 1659. He arrived in New Amsterdam, present-day New York City, sometime between 1638 and 1649. In 1652, he purchased a farm comprising 50 acres in what is now Midtown Manhattan, including the site of the Empire State, what is now the Empire State Building. The property included approximately what is now the area between Lexington Avenue and Fifth Avenue. Klaus's son, Nicholas, was the first. He changed the spelling from Van Rosenvelt to simply Roosevelt, and was the first to hold political office as an alderman in New York, essentially a city councilman. Nicholas's children, Johann and Jakob, were respectively the progenitors of the 2 branches. So Johann was the progenitor of the Oyster Bay Roosevelt branch, and Jakob was the progenitor of the Hyde Park branch. By the 19th century, which we're covering, the Hyde Park Roosevelts were generally associated with the Democratic Party, and the Oyster Bay Roosevelts with the Republican Party. Theodore Roosevelt was an Oyster Bay Roosevelt, was the uncle of Eleanor, so she was also an Oyster Bay Roosevelt, but later wife of Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Hyde Park Roosevelt. Anyway, Guy Carlton Bailey was Dr. Richard's son. Archbishop Bailey's father became a physician like his father. He married his second cousin, Grace Roosevelt. So they thought of themselves as European aristocrats, and that's what European aristocrats do. They marry their relatives. They married in 1813. Grace Roosevelt was the daughter of Jacob Roosevelt, the Hyde Park founder. The future Archbishop Bailey was the couple's first child, Guy Roosevelt and Grace. Guy Bailey and Grace Roosevelt's first child. He was born in New York City, 1814, baptized Episcopal at Trinity Church, September 21st of that year. The following year, Guy, the father, purchased 3 pieces of land in Westchester County, still in New York State. The family made their new home on a 50-acre plot known as Nelson Hill. In this home, 3 other children were born. The future Archbishop Bailey's mother, Grace Roosevelt, died in 1828, and James was sent to boarding school at the Mount Pleasant Classical Institute in Amherst, Massachusetts. James proved to be an avid reader, but not a reclusive scholar type. He was a scholar type, but not a reclusive type. He made many school friends, and he kept them throughout his life. He joined the school's Alexandrian Literary Society, where he got to practice public speaking and debate, which would serve him well in his later career. In 1833, he graduated from the boarding school, then moved on to college, Washington College in Hartford, Connecticut. There he joined another literary society called the Athenaeum. He earned his baccalaureate degree from Washington College in 1835. Initially decided to follow in the footsteps of his father and grandfather by studying medicine. He did so for 1 year. Because of his family's relations to Episcopal clergy, in college he lived with an old school friend of his relative who was Episcopal clergy. This guy was also an Episcopal clergyman, the Reverend Dr. Samuel Jarvis. So instead of living in the dorm in college, Washington College, he lived with this guy, lived with an Anglican, Episcopal clergy, and under this guy's influence and reading in this guy's library, James decided to not become a doctor and instead to become an Episcopal clergyman. He was ordained a deacon, Episcopal deacon in Christ Church in 1839. Shortly afterward, he received a letter from his cousin, Emma, informing him that through his family connections, he was to be assigned to St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Harlem, New York, while the senior clergyman there, Reverend Abram Hart, was absent long-term due to illness. Bailey served there through the winter, 1839-1840, and then spent the following summer at Zion Church in Avon. Then Hart, the clergy at St. Andrew's, he had a relapse of his illness, forcing him to retire in September as rector of St. Andrew's in Harlem. And so the Reverend James Roosevelt Bailey was signed into the parish register of St. Andrew's, dated October 19th, 1840, that the Reverend James Roosevelt Bailey, deacon, received and accepted a call to the rectorship of the church. So he's now the senior clergy. And to this end, he was ordained in what the Episcopals regard as, ordained as a priest in St. Andrews in 1841. As early as 1842, Bailey was studying the Church Fathers. to prepare homilies, prepare sermons. Now, as you know, he's a clergy. He's essentially the pastor of that church, so he's got to preach on a regular basis. So, looking for inspiration and material, he was reading the Church Fathers, which, because of his classical education, he could do in the original. He could actually read Latin and Greek. So, as early as 1842, he mentioned to friends that reading the Church Fathers, specifically, he mentioned St. Jerome, was causing him to question the anti-popery bias with which he was raised as an Episcopal. While serving as rector of St. Andrew's, he often received money to be distributed among the poor. But his parish was very wealthy at the time, so there were no poor who actually lived in his parish. So he used that money directing his ministry to the poor in New York who were Irish and for the most part Catholic. So even though he was an Episcopal priest, for reasons of charity, he came to know Irish Catholics. But he couldn't just walk on the street and give out money. So he made contact with a Catholic priest who was pastor of a Catholic church in Harlem, St. Paul's in Harlem. And this was an Irish immigrant priest named Father Michael Curran. So Bailey would get him the money with the understanding that this money was stipulated for the poor. Another Catholic priest whom Bailey met in this period was pastor of St. Joseph's Church, Father, but later Archbishop of New York, John Mccluskey, and who was also later the first American cardinal. Mcquade was only 4 years older than Bailey. Bailey's time in addition to befriending Father Michael Curran, Bailey hit it off with Father Mccluskey, later Archbishop. And in discussions with them, especially Mccluskey, this is how we can date that as early as 1842, based on his discussions with them and what they recorded at those discussions, that studying the Church Fathers was leading Bailey, James Roosevelt Bailey, to cross the Tiber, as they would say, to become Catholic. After many such discussions, it became obvious to Mccluskey that Bailey was on the verge of becoming Catholic, but still hesitated to take that final step. So Bailey decided to take a trip to Rome to go to the source. Mccluskey gave Bailey advice about traveling to Rome, gave him 2 letters of introduction, one to the rector of the Pontifical Irish College in Rome and another to the rector of the English College in Rome. Bailey arrived in Rome on February 24th, 1842. Which was a Thursday. On Sunday, he went to Mass to hear the rector of the English College preach. The next day, he took his letter of introduction to the Irish College, where he met Father Paul Cullen, who received him, gave him and helped him find lodgings in the city. On March 10th, he visited the English College and formally introduced himself to Father Baggs, whom he had already heard preach but hadn't spoken to, and showed him the letter of introduction. Not only from Mccluskey, but another letter he had from a converted Episcopal clergy in Boston, Massachusetts, George Haskins, whom Bailey had also reached out to during this period of discernment. In April, Bailey had spoken to Haskins about his doubts regarding Catholicism and Protestantism. So Haskins had offered to secure him a room at near the Church of the Jesu, the Jesuit church in Rome, to make a retreat, to figure out what was going on. On April 19th, Bailey began a retreat at the Jesu, following the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. He was under the direction of a Jesuit, Father Bartholomew Esmond. On the evening of April 25th into the morning of the 26th, Bailey made a general confession and received conditional baptism as a Catholic on April 28, 1842. Subsequently, he received confirmation and then First Communion. That was the order. They did it then, which is different from today, from a cardinal, Cardinal Fransoni. Bailey and Haskins remained in Rome for another month after the formal conversion. So they paid a number of visits to the urban college in Rome, where Bailey met and befriended William O'Hara, a later archbishop, James Corcoran, and James Wood, who was a fellow convert, and James Wood would also become a future archbishop. On May 30th, the group got an audience with the Pope, Gregory XVI. The two friends, Haskins and Bailey, left Rome on June 7th. They stopped in Paris on August 2nd. From Paris, Bailey wrote to Dagger John, back in New York, who at the time was coadjutor of New York, informing the bishop, Bishop John Hughes, of his conversion, told him his story, and of his intention that he had discerned in his retreat at the Yezu. He had discerned a call to Catholic priesthood, and he was asking the bishop for advice, because Bailey was from New York, so the Hughes was his bishop. In the meanwhile, till he got a response, Bailey remained in Paris. He moved into a room at the Seminary of Saint-Sulpice in Paris on August 5th, 1842. Later in the month, Bishop Hughes was going to Rome, and he stopped in Paris, so he actually got to meet. They met. Bishop Hughes met him at the Seminary of Saint-Sulpice. And Bishop Hughes told him, Bailey, that he would accept him, but he wanted him to return to New York and have some Catholic studies at St. John's College, which is now Fordham. In 1907, it changed its name to Fordham University, and is still there. So Bailey, that's what he did. He sailed for New York on October 3rd, 1843. He arrived in New York on Sunday, November 12th, 1843. So he did his Catholic studies at St. John's College. He already had his classics. He was already very well educated, but he had to have some Catholic background. During Lent, 1844, he was tonsured and received minor orders. He was admitted to the subdiaconate, ordained to the subdiaconate on February 28th, then to the diaconate on March 1st. He was ordained a priest on March 2nd, 1844, by Dagger John, Bishop Hughes, in St. Patrick's Old Cathedral. A week later, he was present in the same cathedral on March 10th for the consecration of his old friend John Mccluskey as coadjutor bishop of New York. Bailey soon learned that as punishment for his conversion to Catholicism, he was disinherited by his family, and that is a considerable estate. And you keep in mind who he's related to. That inheritance, in the amount of money in 1844 when he found out about it, was $70,000. But that's the equivalent in 2020 money of $2.2 million. But his family punished him for, the conversion. As for his other duties as a new Catholic priest, the president of St. John's College, Fordham College, John Harley, was absent for a great part of the time, raising money, for the college, as it's, a lamentable necessity in our world. And then Harley got sick, so much of the actual work devolved on Bailey, Father Bailey. 1845, Bailey made a trip to Albany in this capacity, representing the college. He secured a charter for St. John's College from the New York State Legislature, granting them full university powers. In July of 1846, Bishop Hughes transferred the governance or the administration of St. John's College to the Jesuits. And so Bailey was transferred. He was appointed to a parish in New Brighton on Staten Island. And that included responsibility. He had a mission station to visit as well as a hospital. So pastor with two, other assignments. So that's, that's what happens. Upon Father Harley's death on December 8th, 1846, Bishop Hughes appointed Bailey to replace Harley as his, meaning the bishop's, private secretary. In May of 1852, Father Bailey accompanied Bishop Hughes to the First Plenary Council of Baltimore, where the American bishops decided to create a number of new dioceses, or to ask Rome to create a number of new dioceses, which was routine, and the Pope did. On July 29, 1853, Pope Pius IX established the Diocese of Newark, New Jersey, and named Father James Bailey as the founding bishop. At the time, it consisted of 40,000 Catholics, served by 33 churches and 30 priests. The diocese at the time embraced the whole state of New York, which previously had been divided. Not the state of New Jersey, embraced the whole state of New Jersey, which previously had been divided between the Diocese of Philadelphia and the Archdiocese of New York. On October 11th, Bailey wrote to Cardinal Fransoni, the guy who accepted him into the church in Rome, acknowledging reception and acceptance of the nomination. Two other newly created dioceses in the same act were the Diocese of Brooklyn and the Diocese of Burlington. They were suffragans of the Archdiocese of New York. So this provided the occasion for the three new bishops elect to be consecrated in their metropolitan cathedral in New York in the same ceremony. So that's the first time in American history that we had such a ceremony where three bishops were ordained at the same time in the same place. Bailey and his fellow guys being ordained, one was John Laughlin, whom he had met in Rome, and another was Louis de Gaubriand. The big ceremony took place on October 30th, 1853, in Old St. Patrick's Cathedral, presided over by Archbishop Gaetano Bedini, whom we met earlier, the Apostolic Nuncio to Brazil, who was then en route going back to Rome. His friend, Bailey's friend, Bishop John Mccluskey of Albany, and another Bishop Amadeus Ropp of Cleveland, whom we already met, assisted as co-consecrating bishops. Bailey was installed as Bishop of Newark in his church, in which, just to confuse things, was also named St. Patrick's, but it was not the same as the one in New York. That was a pre-existing parish which was designated as the cathedral of the new diocese. There, in the ceremony of installation in Newark, he met Father Bernard Mcquade, who was the pastor of that church, and so was then de facto the rector of the cathedral. And Mcquade would later become the founding bishop of Rochester. Okay. At this point in U.S. Catholic history, sufficient source material survives to enable a reconstruction of a multi-generational continuity of relationships, stretching back to colonial times and extending forward to the liberal-conservative rift that still characterizes the U.S. Catholic Church. All the details will never be known, but we have now reached a moment in time at which it is possible to identify some of the how and the when. The divergence became permanent. Bailey's background prior to ordination connects us to his aunt, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, who was born when New York was still a colony of England. So that's the connection to the colonial period. Like her, he converted. You remember, she was born an Anglican, so like her, he converted from, well, in her case, Anglicanism, in his case, Episcopalianism, which was the post-American Revolution version of Anglicanism in the United States. In his time as Bishop of Newark, Bishop Bailey became mentor to future ultramontane leaders, future conservative leaders, including Bishop Mcquade, who was originally the rector of his first cathedral, and later Archbishop Corrigan, who was later Archbishop of New York. Yet later in his life, Bailey became Archbishop of Baltimore. And he was also mentor in Baltimore to guys who later became senior Americanist or liberal prelates. Most noteworthy, the guy who became later an Archbishop of Baltimore, James Gibbons. The apparent contradiction of how the same guy could be mentor to two sets of prelates who later their differences will become so solidified that it extends to today is consistent with everything we've covered. If just keep all the context in mind. So, born an Episcopal, which is the U.S. version of Anglicanism, Bailey grew up with a subordinationist ecclesiology. Deeply patriotic, with pristine veneration for the unique role of the United States and its Constitution in world history. Yet, as a convert, Bailey also nurtured the zeal of a convert and the pro-papal ultramontanism of a person who studied his way into Catholicism. In part, after coming to terms with the countless falsifications and attacks against the Petrine ministry of the papacy that had been perpetuated by Protestants for centuries. In Newark, 1853, the three lives intersect. Mcquade was already a priest in Newark when Bailey arrived. Bailey, as Bishop of Newark, accepted Michael Corrigan, as a seminarian for the Diocese of Newark. In the course of his studies, Corrigan was once taught and came under the influence of Mcquade. Corrigan later followed Bailey as Bishop of Newark and later Archbishop of New York. The liturgical and the logistical arrangements for Bailey's installation in New York were handled by the priest who was pastor of that church, and that became the cathedral, Father Bernard Mcquade. Named for his father emigrated from Ireland, from Tyrone, Ireland, to the United States, settled in what is Powell's Hook, but what is now Jersey City, in the state of New Jersey. It was in the Mcquade home, Bernard Mcquade's father's home, that Mass was first said in Powell's Hook by Father John Conran on the first Sunday of Advent, November 1829. Mcquade's mother died when he was young. His father was killed in a bar fight. Mcquade spent the balance of his childhood in a Catholic orphanage run by the Sisters of Charity, after which he chose an ecclesiastical life. Local clergy, as well as contacts among the sisters, secured Mcquade a scholarship position in a college in Quebec, after which he entered St. John's Seminary, which is now Fordham. Well, St. John's College, and it was a seminary attached to St. John's College, which is now Fordham. This culminated in his ordination in Old St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York on January 16, 1848, by Dagger John, Bishop John Hughes of New York. Most of the state of New Jersey was at that time included in the Diocese of New York. So Mcquade, that's how, even though he was ordained for New York, we meet him first in New Jersey. So he was first assigned to Madison, New Jersey. Okay. So 1853, Bailey goes there as bishop, and he makes Mcquade rector of the Cathedral of St. Patrick. When the Civil War broke out, Mcquade was the first priest in Newark to support publicly the cause of the Union. He also volunteered as a chaplain, and he accompanied a New Jersey brigade. And in the course of his services, he was captured and was a prisoner of war for a time of the Confederacy. The war ended 1865, and he was freed. The following year, 1866, Bishop Bailey appointed Mcquade as his vicar general, in which capacity he accompanied Bailey to the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore, held that year. With the bishop, Mcquade founded Seton Hall College, and without giving up his parish duties or his diocesan office, served as president of Seton Hall College for a decade. He also helped establish the Sisters of Charity of St. Elizabeth in the Diocese of Newark. Seton Hall, now university, is still there. It's a private Catholic university located in South Orange, New Jersey. It had several locations. Now it's in South Orange, New Jersey. Founded in 1856 by then Bishop Bailey, and Mcquade was its first president. He named it, Bishop Bailey named it after his aunt, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. Seton Hall is the oldest diocesan university in the United States. And it arose out of that the second plenary council that they attended in 1866, held in Baltimore, which lamented the largely illiterate state of American Catholics because so many were immigrants, and either they, even if they did speak English like the Irish, because of the British occupation, many of them were illiterate, and then other immigrants who came, they might be literate in their own language but not in English. So there's the idea of building up Catholic educational institutions. Bailey saw this need, decided to act on it, as he had a lifelong interest in scholarship himself. On September 1st, 1856, they opened it was called Old Seton Hall in Madison, New Jersey. In 1860, the school moved to its present location in South Orange and was incorporated, received a charter as a college from the state of New Jersey in 1861. The college also had a seminary, which was necessary for educating new priests. And Mcquade, Father Mcquade, served as the first college president and directed the staff. Initially, there were only 4 priests because it was, small, but it grew. And initially, it only had 5 students. But by the end of the year, first year, the student body had grown to 60. Despite the original need, the number of new recruits to the priesthood exceeded the abilities of the seminary to train them in a timely fashion. So Bailey was instrumental in founding the North American College in Rome, where seminarians studying for the United States would live in Rome while they took classes at one of the Roman universities. And then when they finished, they'd come back to serve in the United States. When the North American was established, one of the seminarians Bailey sent, was one who had studied already at Seton Hall under Mcquade. And this is the third of the guys, Michael Corrigan, the future Archbishop of New York. Michael Augustine Corrigan was born on August 13th, 1839, in Newark, New Jersey, the 5th of 9 children. Both of his parents were Irish immigrants, Thomas and Mary. Thomas, his father, owned a retail grocery and liquor business in Newark. So the family was well-to-do, middle class. But it was the immigrant story. They came with nothing. They opened a family business, and it did well. So, they went in the middle class. And that allowed Michael, to pursue educational interest, as the family had the means to do that. They didn't have to put him to work, as soon as he could walk. So they sent him to St. Mary's College in Wilmington, Delaware, and then to Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Then he spent a year in Europe. He received his baccalaureate degree from Mount St. Mary's in 1859. He then became a member of the first class of the North American College in Rome, ordained a priest in September 1863 at the Basilica of St. John Lateran, which is the cathedral of the Pope, as Bishop of Rome. And he received a doctorate of divinity in 1864. He returned to New Jersey the same year, where he joined the faculty of Seton Hall College as a professor of theology and history. And there Father Mcquade became a friend and mentor. He earned a reputation for sound scholarship and for theological and ecclesial ultramontanism, pro-papal ecclesiology. Father Mcquade had a profound effect not only on Corrigan, but on other students and seminarians. When the Diocese of Rochester, New York, was created on March 3rd, 1868, and carved out of 8 counties were carved out of the Diocese of Buffalo to create the Diocese of Newark. It consisted of 54,000 Catholics, served by 35 parishes and 29 missions. Father Mcquade was appointed founding bishop of Rochester, ordained on July 12, 1868, in St. Patrick's, New York, by Bailey's old friend, who by this point was Archbishop John Mccluskey. Bishop Bailey was present as one of the co-consecrators. Mcquade's sort of spiritual son, the future Archbishop Corrigan, followed Mcquade in both of his duties as president of Seton Hall and as vicar general for the Diocese of Newark. The following year, the new bishop, Mcquade, attended the First Vatican Council, arriving in Rome on November 26, 1869. 5 days later, he wrote a letter to his vicar general in Rochester, Father James Early, who was rector of his cathedral. And also, to confuse things, this is yet another cathedral, another St. Patrick's Cathedral, this one in Rochester. He commented in a letter dated December 1st, 1869, quote, "Since coming to Europe, I have heard much of the question of the infallibility of the Pope. The feeling is very strong, pro and con." Though Mcquade dismissed it as, quote, "this most unnecessary question." As the son of Irish immigrants, Mcquade internalized the Anglo-American Maryland ecclesiology of accommodationism to avoid antagonizing the Protestant ruling class. He feared that the definition of infallibility would inflame anti-Catholic activity in the United States. And in return, he believed the definition provided no real benefit to the Church, because in his mind, loyal Catholics followed papal teaching. Disloyal Catholics did not. A declaration of infallibility would not change this in any way, he believed. He wrote again to Father Early on April 24, 1870, commenting, quote, "My hope is that in the definition, the Pope will in some way be connected with the Church. I cannot conceive of a living head without a body. However, I must not enter into this vexed question, which has been such a disturbance to my mind, that since I came to Rome, that once it is disposed of, one way or another, I never want to hear of it again." On the day of the vote, July 18, 1870, Mcquade was one of those who did not attend the session, though he was still in Rome. When he returned to Rochester, he delivered a sermon in his cathedral on August 28, 1870, in which he publicly stated his faith in the dogma of infallibility. Otherwise, his earlier statement to Father Early was correct. After the council, infallibility was not a problem for Mcquade. I mean, he didn't object to the theology. He was just worried that it would trigger a persecution. And later he developed into one of the ultramontane conservative leaders of the U.S. hierarchy. Students like Corrigan internalized that ultramontane ecclesiology from him, which shaped their interaction with progressive, liberal, Americanist clergy. Mcquade was especially devoted to the cause of Catholic education, which was one of the areas of conflict, as we've seen, Catholic schools, between ultramontanes and Americanists. In the Diocese of Rochester, Bishop Mcquade organized a parochial school system taught by nuns and affiliated it with the state university. He opened St. Andrew's Preparatory Seminary, the promising students of which he sent to European seminaries to complete their education in order to come back as professors at St. Bernard Seminary, which he opened, the major seminary, which he opened in 1893. Meanwhile, Mcquade was constantly extending the parishes throughout the diocese, founding new works of charity, and four more religious houses for religious. Meanwhile, as Bishop of Newark, back to Bishop James Roosevelt Bailey, he also promoted Catholic schools. That influenced both Mcquade and Corrigan, and was in part responsible for their later differences with Americanist prelates who favored public schools in one form or another, and did not want to promote Catholic schools because they saw it as something that would impede assimilation of Catholics into the larger population. In May of 1854, Bailey expressed the hope that soon he would have, quote, every Catholic child in the state in Catholic schools. Bailey realized that in order to be effective in this mission, he needed the help of religious women, a diocesan congregation. In 1857, a group of Benedictine sisters arrived from Pennsylvania, and in the following year, Bailey sent 5 women to train with the Sisters of Charity. Many other communities of religious men, brothers to teach in the boys' schools and women to teach, well, women actually we teach both, boys and girls, came over the next decades. The ranking prelate of the United States was the Most Reverend Martin Spalding, Archbishop of Baltimore. He died on February 7, 1872. Bailey was transferred to succeed him as Archbishop of Baltimore on July 30, 1872. Michael Corrigan, followed Bailey as Bishop of Newark. Becoming the second bishop of that diocese, Corrigan was ordained a bishop on May 4, 1879. And at the time, the Diocese of Newark still encompassed the whole state of New Jersey. Corrigan administered Newark during a time of rapid population growth. Roman Catholic institutional development occurred in a parallel fashion to serve them, as many of the immigrants were Catholic Irish, Catholic Germans, Catholic Italians, Catholic Poles. Corrigan was appointed coadjutor archbishop to John Cardinal Mccluskey, on October 1st, 1880. So that catches us up to where we started this little unit. We shall have occasion to meet all these guys again, especially the three, the Bailey, Mcquade, and Corrigan, in the context of disputes with Americanists, which etched a rift in the American Catholic hierarchy, mirrored in the American Catholic population that is still with us. Okay, let's see how long we've been going. Okay, we'll stop here. Next, we'll move to the next year, 1881, when history changed. History changed again, not specifically in the church, but it certainly would affect us, as Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell formed a telephone company. All right, so for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.